Picture this: monks in dark robes, their faces illuminated by flickering firelight, systematically feeding ancient manuscripts into hungry flames. One by one, centuries of accumulated knowledge about the human body and its capacity for self-healing turns to ash. This actually happened, and the healing practice they tried to erase was so powerful that the church considered it a direct threat to their authority. But here's the thing: they didn't get everything. Some texts survived, hidden in remote monasteries, buried in private collections, and encoded in seemingly innocent medical treatises. What I'm about to share with you will completely change how you think about healing. And if you want to discover more hidden history that mainstream narratives tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're just getting started. The practice I'm talking about is called somatic healing, but that modern term doesn't do justice to what it actually was. In medieval Europe, there existed a sophisticated understanding of how physical touch, breath, and mental focus could cure diseases that baffled physicians. This wasn't superstition or wishful thinking. These healers, often women living on the edges of villages, could set bones with precision that wouldn't be matched by mainstream medicine for centuries. They understood the connection between emotional trauma and physical illness before psychology even existed as a discipline. They used their hands to detect subtle changes in body temperature and texture that indicated internal problems. And most threatening of all to the church, they did it without prayer, without intercession, without needing an institution between them and the healing. So why did the church want this knowledge destroyed? Follow the money and the power. In medieval society, the church held a monopoly on suffering and salvation. If you were sick, you were told it was punishment for sin. The cure wasn't medical treatment, but confession, penance, and donations to the church. The sacraments were presented as the only legitimate pathway to wellness. Now imagine some village woman who could cure your headaches by manipulating pressure points on your skull, or who could ease your chronic back pain through targeted massage and breathing exercises. Suddenly, you don't need the priest. You don't need to buy indulgences. You don't need the institution at all. That made these healers more dangerous than any heretic with a theological disagreement. The persecution ramped up dramatically during the witch trial era, but it started much earlier. As early as the 11th century, church councils began issuing edicts against what they called unlicensed healing. They framed it as protecting people from charlatans, but read the actual documents and you'll see what really bothered them. These healers were predominantly women. They passed knowledge from mother to daughter, from mentor to apprentice, completely outside the male-dominated, church-controlled university system. The church insisted that only university-trained physicians could practice medicine, and guess what? Universities were closed to women, and their curriculum was approved by, you guessed it, the church. The Inquisition took things to a whole new level. Inquisitors created detailed manuals for identifying these healers, and the criteria are revealing. Did she use herbs? Suspicious but not conclusive. Did she combine herbs with touch-based manipulation? Now we're getting into dangerous territory. Did she claim that the healing came from understanding the body's own natural processes rather than from God's grace? That's when the torture began. Under interrogation, these healers were forced to reveal their techniques, which were meticulously recorded, and then those very records were used as evidence to convict them. After conviction, both the healer and her texts were burned. The Inquisition kept copies for themselves, locked away in Vatican archives, but the public versions were destroyed. Yet some texts survived, and they're absolutely fascinating. One of the most significant is a manuscript that surfaced in a German monastery in the 19th century. Written in a mixture of Latin and Old German, it describes techniques that modern physical therapists would instantly recognize. There are instructions for releasing trigger points in muscle tissue, for using sustained pressure to break up adhesions, for mobilizing joints through specific ranges of motion. The text explains that pain often originates far from where it's felt, that referred pain patterns can be mapped and treated systematically. This was written in the 13th century, but mainstream medicine wouldn't rediscover these principles until the 20th century work of Janet Travell and others. Another surviving fragment, this one found in a Spanish convent, focuses on what we now call visceral manipulation. The text describes how organs can become restricted in their movement, creating dysfunction and pain throughout the body. It gives precise instructions for palpating the abdomen to detect these restrictions and for using gentle, sustained pressure to restore normal organ mobility. Modern osteopaths use virtually identical techniques, but this manuscript predates modern osteopathy by 600 years. The nun who wrote it noted that she was recording knowledge passed down through 7 generations of healers in her family, meaning this practice extends back potentially to the 7th or 8th century. What's remarkable about these surviving texts is how scientific they are. There's no mysticism, no appeals to supernatural forces. Instead, they read like anatomy and physiology manuals. One describes the circulatory system with surprising accuracy, explaining how stagnant blood can accumulate in tissues and cause inflammation, and how specific massage techniques can encourage circulation and drainage. Another talks about what we'd now call the nervous system, describing how pressure on certain points can send signals that interrupt pain and reset abnormal muscle tension. They didn't have our modern terminology, but they clearly understood the underlying principles. The techniques themselves are incredibly sophisticated. One method that appears in multiple surviving texts involves assessing the entire body before treating any single symptom. The healer would observe posture, watch the person walk, palpate from head to toe, checking for temperature variations, tissue texture changes, and areas of tenderness. Only after this comprehensive assessment would treatment begin, and it would address the root cause, not just the symptom. If someone came in with knee pain, the healer might spend most of the session working on their hip and foot, because that's where the actual problem originated. This whole-body root cause approach is exactly what modern manual therapists are taught. But these medieval healers figured it out through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Breathing techniques feature prominently in the surviving texts, and here's where things get really interesting. These healers understood that how you breathe affects everything from muscle tension to pain perception to emotional state. They taught patients specific breathing patterns to use during treatment to maximize effectiveness. They used breath to help diagnose problems, noting that restricted breathing often indicated restricted movement in the ribcage or spine. They combined breath with movement in exercises that look strikingly similar to modern yoga or qigong, despite developing independently in medieval Europe. One text describes a breathing exercise for chronic anxiety that's basically identical to the box breathing technique taught to Navy SEALs today. The connection between emotions and physical health is another theme that runs through these manuscripts. The healers recognized that grief often manifested as chest tightness, that anger showed up as neck and shoulder tension, that fear created stomach problems. They didn't just treat the physical manifestation, they addressed the emotional component. One remarkable passage describes how to create a safe space for someone to process trauma while simultaneously using touch to release the physical holding patterns that trauma created in their body. This is essentially what modern somatic therapy does, but again, these healers were doing it centuries before psychology existed as a field. So how did they develop such advanced knowledge without the scientific method, without microscopes, without modern anatomy texts? The answer is time and attention. These healing lineages stretch back generations, with each healer adding to the accumulated knowledge. They paid meticulous attention to what worked and what didn't. They compared notes across different healing families, and crucially, they listened to the body. Modern medicine often treats the body as a machine to be fixed, but these healers treated it as a teacher to be learned from. They developed highly refined palpation skills, able to detect subtle changes in tissue quality that told them what was happening beneath the surface. They observed patterns across thousands of patients over decades of practice. After the worst of the persecution ended, fragments of this knowledge persisted in unexpected places. Barber surgeons who occupied a weird middle ground between folk healers and licensed physicians preserved some of the techniques. Midwives, who the church couldn't completely eliminate because childbirth was too important, kept alive knowledge about pelvic manipulation and pain management. In rural areas far from church authority, village healers continued practicing in secret, passing knowledge orally when written texts became too dangerous. Some of the techniques got absorbed into early physical therapy and osteopathy, though without acknowledgement of their medieval origins. The tragedy is how much was lost. Based on references in surviving texts to other manuscripts, we know that detailed works on using touch to treat everything from epilepsy to infertility were destroyed. There were apparently illustrated anatomical texts created by healers who learned anatomy through hands-on palpation rather than dissection, offering a different perspective on the body's structure. Advanced techniques for treating what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder, developed through working with soldiers returning from the Crusades, were recorded in manuscripts that no longer exist. Entire healing lineages, representing centuries of accumulated wisdom, ended with a woman burning at the stake. But here's what gives me hope. The human body hasn't changed. The same techniques that worked in medieval times work now because they're based on anatomy and physiology that remain constant. Modern practitioners who have studied the surviving texts report that the techniques are immediately applicable and often more effective than contemporary methods. There's a small but growing movement of therapists and bodyworkers who are researching these historical practices and integrating them into modern practice. They're proving that this wasn't primitive medicine that we've surpassed, It was sophisticated medicine that we forgot and are only now rediscovering. Some of the surviving techniques are simple enough that anyone can use them. There's a method for releasing tension headaches that involves gentle, sustained pressure on specific points at the base of the skull while breathing deeply. It works by releasing the suboccipital muscles, which often go into spasm during stress or poor posture. Another technique for lower back pain involves lying on your back with knees bent and slowly, mindfully rolling your pelvis forward and back, paying attention to any restrictions or asymmetries in the movement. This mobilizes the lumbar spine and releases the psoas muscle, a common source of back pain. These techniques appear in multiple surviving manuscripts, described in almost identical terms, suggesting they were widely used and highly effective. The emotional release component is something modern medicine is only beginning to take seriously, but these medieval healers understood it deeply. They recognized that the body keeps score, that unprocessed experiences get stored in tissue, creating chronic tension and pain. They knew that sometimes when you release a physical restriction, emotions come up, and that's not a side effect, that's part of the healing. One text describes how to support someone through this process, how to create safety, how to help them stay present with what's arising rather than dissociating or re-traumatizing. This wisdom was nearly lost forever, but it survived, and it's more relevant now than ever. What's particularly infuriating is how the suppression of this knowledge set back medicine by centuries. While the church was burning healers and their texts in Europe, similar touch-based healing practices were flourishing in other cultures. Traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, and indigenous healing practices around the world developed sophisticated manual therapy techniques. But in Europe, the persecution created a dark age of healing where superstition replaced observation and authority replaced experimentation. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that European medicine began rediscovering principles that medieval healers had understood perfectly well. The surviving manuscripts also reveal something else important. These healers were scientists. They tested their methods, kept records, refined techniques based on outcomes. They had theories about why their treatments worked, and while they didn't have modern terminology, their theories were often remarkably accurate. They practiced evidence-based medicine before that term existed. The church tried to paint them as superstitious witches, but the reality is exactly the opposite. They represented empiricism and observation against dogma and authority. The real superstition was the idea that illness was divine punishment that could only be addressed through religious ritual. Today, we're seeing a renaissance of interest in these practices. Manual therapy, somatic therapy, trauma-informed bodywork, all of these modern fields are rediscovering what was nearly burned out of existence. Physical therapists are learning that you can't separate physical healing from emotional healing. Trauma therapists are learning that you can't resolve trauma purely through talk therapy. You have to address what's held in the body. Pain specialists are learning that chronic pain often has roots in old injuries, postural patterns, and unresolved emotional experiences. All of this was understood by healers who the church condemned as witches and heretics. If those medieval healers could see us now, they'd probably be amazed by our technology, our imaging, our pharmacology. But they might also be puzzled by how much we've overcomplicated things. They might point out that a skilled pair of hands, a comprehensive understanding of anatomy, and genuine presence with a patient can accomplish more than many of our high-tech interventions. They might remind us that the body is self-healing when given the right support, that symptoms are information rather than enemies to be suppressed, and that treating the whole person rather than isolated parts is not alternative medicine, it's the only medicine that actually works. The story of this suppressed healing practice is ultimately a story about power and control. Throughout history, those in authority have tried to control healing because it's a form of power that threatens institutional dominance. If people can heal themselves or can access healing outside official channels, they're harder to control. The church understood this, which is why they were so ruthless in their persecution. But knowledge is remarkably resilient. Even when texts are burned and practitioners are killed, if the techniques work, they find a way to survive. They get whispered from mother to daughter, they get encoded in seemingly innocent documents, they get preserved in practices that fly under the radar of authority. What survived the fires teaches us something crucial. Truth doesn't require institutional validation. These healing practices worked then and they work now, regardless of whether the church approved or whether modern medicine accepts them. The human body responds to skilled, informed touch. Breathing affects physiology. Emotional states manifest physically. Movement heals. These aren't beliefs or opinions, they're observable facts that anyone can verify through direct experience. The surviving texts aren't asking you to believe, they're inviting you to try the techniques and see for yourself. So what can you do with this information? First, understand that your body has wisdom and healing capacity that you've been taught to ignore. You don't always need an expert or an institution to address pain or dysfunction. Second, explore modern practitioners who work in this tradition, manual therapists, somatic practitioners, bodyworkers who understand that healing is a whole person process. Third, learn some basic techniques yourself. The surviving texts suggest that everyone should understand fundamental principles of how their body works and how to support its natural healing processes. And finally, recognize that anytime someone tells you that only they or their institution can provide healing, you're hearing an echo of the same power dynamic that led to the burning of these texts in the first place. The healers whose work was nearly destroyed weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who paid attention, who trusted observation over authority, who refined their skills over years of practice. Their legacy survived not because of institutional protection but despite institutional persecution. Every time a modern therapist discovers that releasing the jaw can resolve headaches, or that addressing old ankle injuries can fix knee pain, or that creating space for emotional expression is essential to physical healing, they're rediscovering what was written in those burned manuscripts. The knowledge is coming back because it's true, and truth has a way of surviving. The irony is that modern science is finally catching up to what these healers knew all along. Fascia research, the study of the connective tissue that surrounds every structure in the body, has revealed that the body is far more interconnected than we ever imagined. It turns out that the whole body approach wasn't just intuitive wisdom, it was anatomically accurate. The fascia is continuous throughout the entire body, creating a three-dimensional web of communication that explains exactly how releasing tension in one area can resolve pain in seemingly unrelated regions. Neural imaging studies have shown that touch activates specific brain regions associated with safety, trust, and healing. Breathwork measurably affects the autonomic nervous system, shifting people from stress states into parasympathetic activation where actual healing occurs. Every discovery in cutting-edge medicine validates something that was written in those medieval manuscripts. What strikes me most when reading these surviving texts is the profound respect they show for the person being treated. Modern medicine often treats patients as problems to be solved, symptoms to be managed, but these healers treated them as whole beings with their own inherent wisdom. They asked questions, they listened, they adapted their approach based on what they learned from each person. They recognized that every body is different, that what works for one person might not work for another, that the healer's job is to support the person's own healing rather than imposing a predetermined protocol. This patient-centered approach is something modern medicine is desperately trying to rediscover after decades of one-size-fits-all treatment. The surviving texts also emphasize something that's almost completely absent from modern medical training: the healer's own state of being. These manuscripts describe how the practitioner's presence, attention, and even their own emotional state directly impacts the patient's healing. They discuss developing inner calm, cultivating compassion, learning to observe without judgment. They understand that healing is a relational process, not something done to someone but something that happens between two people. Modern neuroscience calls this interpersonal neurobiology, but these healers understood it through direct experience. They knew that when you come into contact with someone in a state of genuine presence and care, something shifts in their nervous system that facilitates healing. Think about the implications of this. In a world where healthcare is increasingly mechanized, where doctors spend minutes with patients, where algorithms are making treatment decisions, what these medieval healers understood becomes profoundly relevant. They're showing us that you can't extract healing from relationship, you can't separate the person from their symptoms, you can't create genuine wellness through detachment and efficiency. At the same time, they understood that this relational healing isn't mystical or unmeasurable. It's based on biology, on how nervous systems interact, on how the presence of another calm person directly influences your own physiology. The question that haunts me is what else was lost? Beyond the healing texts that survived, what knowledge was destroyed? The Church's campaign against these healers wasn't random or incidental, it was systematic and intentional. They kept records of everything they persecuted, and those records suggest a vast library of knowledge about the human body and its capacity for self-healing. There were apparently treatises on women's health written by healers who had attended thousands of births and had sophisticated understanding of reproductive physiology. Texts on mental and emotional well-being that predated modern psychology by centuries. Methods for working with pain that were so effective they threatened to undermine the Church's monopoly on suffering and salvation. All of this represented centuries of accumulated wisdom from women who had no formal education but possessed something more valuable: direct observational knowledge earned through hands-on practice with thousands of patients over decades. We'll never know exactly how much was destroyed, but we can estimate based on references in the surviving fragments. Medieval libraries had extensive collections, and the texts we have now are scattered survivors, found in hidden compartments, preserved in codes, protected by individuals who risked their lives to keep them safe. Some may still exist in Vatican archives, locked away and inaccessible to researchers. Some may be lost forever, burned so completely that not even a reference survives. What we can say with certainty is that the loss was enormous, that European medicine developed without the benefit of these practices that could have advanced healing immeasurably, and that we're still recovering from the gap in knowledge that persecution created. But the survivors of persecution were often the strongest and most transformative ideas. The healing practices that made it through, hidden in convents and private libraries, passed orally through generations, encoded in medical texts that looked orthodox enough to pass inspection, these proved resilient for a reason. They worked. They were worth protecting. They were worth dying for in many cases, and that's something to respect. These healers, predominantly women with no formal authority or social power, understood something so valuable that they were willing to pay the ultimate price to preserve it. Their sacrifice means something. It means their knowledge deserves our attention. When you use one of these techniques on yourself or someone else, you're participating in something that survived fire and persecution. You're practicing knowledge that was nearly erased from human civilization. You're part of a lineage that extends back further than we can trace, forward through time to practitioners who will keep refining and developing these approaches. Every person who learns these techniques, who recognizes their validity, who teaches them to others, weakens the cultural narrative that says healing can only happen through institutions and authorities. That's genuinely revolutionary in a world where so much of human experience is still filtered through corporate and governmental structures. The medieval church understood the power of healing knowledge, which is why they were so threatened by it. In our modern era, that same dynamic persists in different forms. Healing knowledge that empowers people is often suppressed or marginalized. Alternative practitioners are dismissed even when their techniques work. Time-intensive, relationship-based healing is economically devalued in favor of high-tech solutions that create more profit. Patients are encouraged to be passive consumers of medical services rather than active participants in their own wellness. The mechanisms are different, but the underlying impulse to control healing and profit from suffering remains. Understanding this history helps us recognize and resist those patterns now. What these surviving texts ultimately teach us is that your body is not a mysterious machine that only experts can understand. It's a sophisticated self-healing system that responds to attention, skilled touch, proper breathing, and genuine care. You have more capacity to influence your own health than you've been led to believe. That doesn't mean never seeing doctors or therapists, but it means recognizing your own agency and responsibility for your well-being. It means developing literacy about your body, understanding how you move, breathe, hold tension, and process emotion. It means treating the practitioners you work with as partners in your healing rather than authorities who hold all the answers. The story of these burned texts and persecuted healers doesn't have a clean ending. We didn't recover everything that was lost. We didn't stop the suppression entirely, though it's become less overtly violent. We didn't see a complete vindication of their knowledge until recently, after centuries had passed. But we did get enough. Enough texts survived to know what was possible. Enough practitioners kept the knowledge alive despite enormous risks. Enough people in modern times have become curious and brave enough to recover and restore these practices. And enough of the evidence supports their efficacy that we can't be dismissed as delusional or superstitious for believing in them. Thank you for exploring this hidden history with me. Thank you for being willing to question the narratives we've been taught about healing, authority, and the body. Thank you for opening yourself to the possibility that there's wisdom in practices that survived despite persecution, knowledge that works whether or not institutions approve of it. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking differently about your own body and your own healing capacity, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more explorations of hidden history and suppressed knowledge. We have so many more stories to uncover together, so many more truths to excavate from the places where institutions tried to bury them. Hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who are committed to discovering what history tried to erase.